He carved the sonic identity of an entire era, yet the fame never truly belonged to him. Others stood in the light while he quietly constructed the heartbeat of the music from the shadows. Through hushed recording rooms and roaring global stages, Benny Andersson witnessed the ascent, the collapse, and the remarkable comeback of one of pop history's most beloved groups. Yet the story he is finally choosing to share has nothing to do with glittering costumes or dance floor anthems. It speaks instead of burnout, of remorse, of love that crumbled, and of a hollow stillness that settled in long after the crowds went home. Following more than 40 years of guesswork and rumor, Benny has finally broken his silence, and what he has revealed is far more profound, far more sorrowful, and far more candid than the world ever anticipated. This is the story of a man who built an empire out of sound. Long before audiences around the globe lost themselves in the euphoria of Dancing Queen or felt their hearts break alongside The Winner Takes It All, Benny Andersson was quietly laying the groundwork for what would grow into one of the most enduring musical legacies pop music has ever produced. He came into the world on December 16, 1946, in the Vasan district of Stockholm, raised in a modest working-class home where music was never considered a profession but rather a beloved family ritual. It was his father, a civil engineer by trade, and his grandfather, a musician who learned entirely on his own, who first placed an accordion in young Benny's hands at the age of 6. That small, wheezing instrument would ignite within him a lifelong obsession with melody and the intricate mathematics of harmony. Where many boys his age dreamed of celebrity and applause, Benny was consumed by something quieter and more internal. He wanted to understand music from the inside out. Whether it was the disciplined counterpoint of Bach or the rustic warmth of traditional Swedish folk melodies, he absorbed it all, teaching himself piano purely by listening, and could reproduce a tune after only 1 or 2 hearings. Before he had even reached his 10th birthday, he was already performing at family gatherings and school events, distinguished not by any desire to dazzle but by a rare and natural sensitivity to tone and emotional nuance. In 1964, at only 18 years of age, Benny joined the Heap Stars, a Swedish rock outfit that had earned itself the flattering nickname of the Swedish Beatles. His presence transformed them almost immediately. The band's musical maturity deepened overnight, and soon they were conquering the Swedish charts with songs like Sunny Girl and Wedding, both written by Benny himself. These early victories did more than simply announce his talent for crafting unforgettable melodies. They sharpened his instincts for studio arrangement and live performance alike, and established him firmly as the group's intellectual and musical engine, even as he quietly absorbed the commercial and technical mechanics of the wider music industry. The next turning point arrived on a memorable evening in 1966. At a mutual friend's party, Benny encountered Bjorn, who was then performing with a folk pop group called the Hoot Nanny Singers. The two men shared an immediate and instinctive understanding of harmony, arrangement, and musical detail. A spontaneous jam session that night sparked a creative partnership that would define both their lives. In the years that followed, they wrote together constantly, exploring different genres and structures, producing material for other Swedish performers as well as themselves. Their bond strengthened not merely out of professional admiration but because they complemented each other with uncanny precision. Benny brought emotional depth and compositional intuition. Bjorn brought wit, verbal dexterity, and lyrical sharpness. By the early 1970s, their personal and professional worlds had become deeply intertwined. Both men were now romantically involved with 2 exceptional female musicians, Agnetha Faltskog, a hugely successful Swedish solo artist, and Annie-Frid Frida Lingstad, a commanding alto-voiced singer with roots in jazz and pop. Together, the 4 began performing and recording under the unwieldy banner of Bjorn and Benny, Agnetha and Annie-Frid. The name was awkward, but the electricity they generated together was undeniable. They attempted to represent Sweden at the Eurovision Song Contest in 1973 and fell short, but they refused to be discouraged. The following year they returned with Waterloo, a bold and infectious glam pop song that swept the 1974 Eurovision contest and launched them into immediate international stardom. Soon after, they streamlined their identity into a single memorable acronym drawn from their initials, ABBA. From that point forward, Benny was no longer simply a pop musician. He had become something closer to an architect of sound. He approached every composition as a painter might approach a canvas, carefully constructing layers of instrumentation, engineering vocal harmonies with surgical precision, and reaching for synthesizers years before the technology became fashionable. Inside the studio, he was celebrated for an almost monastic patience and an uncompromising perfectionism, sometimes dedicating days to a single harmonic passage until it resonated with exactly the emotional truth he was seeking. Commercial trends held no interest for him. He was chasing something that would last. Even as Agnetha and Frida mesmerized audiences in their iconic matching outfits, and Björn fashioned the group's distinctively clever and bittersweet words, it was Benny who gave ABBA's music its emotional skeleton. His compositional signature wove together surface brightness and hidden melancholy, a particularly Swedish quality of sadness dressed in joyful clothing. Songs like Knowing Me, Knowing You and Fernando embodied this paradox perfectly. They smiled on the outside while aching on the inside. That duality was Benny's most enduring contribution, not only to pop music broadly but to every listener who ever sensed something larger and more painful stirring beneath ABBA's seemingly cheerful exterior. He was not merely writing songs. He was constructing an entire world, note by note, chord by chord, silence by silence. And even when the brightest lights pointed somewhere else entirely, the soul of everything ABBA ever created belonged unmistakably to him. For most of the 1970s, ABBA seemed untouchable, riding a wave of popularity that showed no signs of breaking. Yet behind the shining public image, the foundations were developing invisible fractures. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, more like wood quietly rotting than a structure dramatically falling. The first visible crack appeared in 1979 when Björn and Agnetha ended their marriage. The separation was deeply painful on a human level, yet the group attempted to insulate their professional life from the fallout. At that time they were deep in the recording of Super Trooper, and while the album maintained their characteristic gloss and precision, the mood inside the sessions had grown noticeably heavier. 2 years after that, Benny and Frida walked the same painful road. What they had shared was once described as intensely passionate and mutually sustaining, a romance born from music and deepened by it. Their connection had begun back in 1969, years before ABBA existed, and it was rooted in a shared language of sound. Frida had spoken in a 1975 interview about how completely Benny understood her, in a way that no one else ever had. But that profound artistic understanding did not extend as naturally into the rhythms and demands of everyday domestic life. Benny's relentless perfectionism, the very quality that made him extraordinary in the studio, left him emotionally unavailable in the spaces that mattered most at home. Frida, who was by nature expressive and emotionally alive, began to feel his increasing absence. By 1981, Benny disclosed that he had fallen in love with Mona Norklit, a television producer he had met during a broadcast production. He chose to be honest with Frida, but honesty was not enough to repair what had already broken. The separation was handled quietly, without public spectacle, yet it left a wound in the band's inner dynamic that would never fully heal. Their final studio recording together, The Visitors, released that same year, bore the unmistakable imprint of that emotional frost. Songs like When All Is Said and Done and Slipping Through My Fingers were saturated with grief that dared not speak its own name. The luminosity that had once defined them was dimming, and though ABBA would hold together for another year, something irreplaceable had already slipped away for good. For more than 4 decades, the question of how and why ABBA ended remained unanswered in any satisfying way. Unlike so many legendary acts who closed the chapter with a grand farewell tour, a tearful press announcement, or one final triumphant performance, ABBA simply disappeared. Their last official single, Under Attack, arrived in December 1982 without the fanfare their earlier work had commanded. No album followed. No tour was announced. No goodbye was offered. They faded, and in the silence they left behind, speculation filled every available space. Fans and journalists alike debated for decades what had truly torn them apart. Was it money? Was it the romantic collapses? Was it creative exhaustion or irreconcilable artistic differences? None of the four members ever supplied a clear or complete answer. Interviews were deliberately vague. The word hiatus drifted through the discourse like a placeholder with no expiration date. Public appearances grew sparse and carefully managed. Over time, ABBA became less a band than a legend suspended in amber, a perfect pop phenomenon that had simply ceased to exist without ever explaining itself. That silence broke in November 2024. Benny Andersson, a man who had spent decades deflecting personal questions and keeping his interior life carefully guarded, agreed to sit down with The Guardian for a candid conversation. He came without a prepared script. There was no team of publicists engineering his message, no polished story designed to manage public perception. Instead, he offered something far more valuable. He was plain and direct. "We were exhausted," he said simply. "The marriages were disintegrating. The music was beginning to feel forced and false. Stopping was the only way to protect what remained of ourselves." That quiet, unadorned confession landed with far greater impact than any dramatic revelation could have. In a handful of words, Benny confirmed what the most perceptive fans had long sensed. The end had not come from anger or betrayal or creative warfare. It had come from a profound depletion of emotional resources. After years of performing happiness for the world while privately watching their lives come apart, all four of them had simply run dry. Not in a violent or spectacular way, but in the quiet, grinding way that wears people down until there is nothing left to give. Then in April 2025, Benny expanded on these reflections in a conversation with Billboard magazine. He described the final stretch of 1981 and 1982 as a period of hollow routine. The creative fire that had once made their sessions feel electric and purposeful had cooled into something mechanical. He and Bjorn continued to write, but the music arrived more slowly and felt less alive. Sessions grew shorter. The work that had once felt like a calling had begun to feel merely like employment. When he addressed the group's decision to walk away, he refused to frame it as either failure or tragedy. He described it instead as something that had simply become impossible to sustain. They could not keep performing a version of themselves that no longer existed. They could not pretend to each other or to the world. This candor served as more than revelation. It was a kind of absolution. For years, audiences had sensed that ABBA's final recordings carried a weight that their earlier work had not. The visitors felt different in a way that was difficult to articulate. Songs like One of Us, Like an Angel Passing Through My Room, and The Day Before You Came were not merely melancholic in tone. They were genuinely suffused with loss and resignation. The sadness was not stylistic. It was real, and listeners had always known it, even without the language to explain why. Benny's honesty gave them that language at last. Notably, none of what he shared was colored by resentment. He assigned no blame to Bjorn, to Agnetha, or to Frida. He spoke of the ending the way one might speak of a river that has finally reached the sea, as something that followed its own inevitable course. They had given what they were capable of giving. When that capacity was spent, continuing would have meant betraying the music itself. For the millions who had carried ABBA's songs through their own private sorrows and joys, this was a form of closure they had never known they needed. The long mystery had an answer at last. The silence had not been evasion. It had been survival. After ABBA quietly dissolved, Frida's life took a direction that surprised nearly everyone. In 1992, she wed Prince Heinrich Rutzo-Roos of Plauen, entering the world of European aristocracy in a single remarkable step. The Swedish media could barely contain its astonishment. The woman who had once commanded stadium audiences in dazzling costumes was now residing in a Swiss castle, navigating the rigid protocols of royal life. Yet the fairy tale had a hollow center. The impulsive, emotionally vivid performer who had poured herself into every song she sang struggled profoundly within the stiff formality of aristocratic expectation. And then came a loss that made everything else feel insignificant. In 1998, her daughter Annie Frid and Lise passed away in a car accident in New York City. She was only 30 years old. The grief was absolute. The woman who had once given her voice to millions retreated into near total silence, living in seclusion near Lake Geneva, far from both the glamour of her royal life and the fame of her musical past. None of it held any meaning against the absence of her daughter. Yet it was during this period of deepest mourning that Benny quietly reached back across the years. Despite everything that had passed between them, he made contact. They carried a shared history that no one else on earth could fully comprehend, and in that reconnection, however subdued, there was genuine solace. Not nostalgia, not a revisiting of old glories, but simply the comfort of being truly known by someone who had been present for all of it. Frida, who had once needed an audience to feel real, discovered in this quieter chapter of her life that being remembered by a single person who truly knew her was enough. In 2018, the unimaginable happened. After 36 years of separation, ABBA gathered again to record new music. The world reacted with disbelief and delight in equal measure. What followed was not a conventional reunion but something entirely without precedent in popular music. By 2021, Benny and Bjorn had produced a complete studio album titled Voyage, with Benny commanding every aspect of the production. The accompanying live experience was equally revolutionary. Rather than performing in person, the group collaborated with cutting-edge technology to create digital versions of their 1979 selves, rendered through motion capture and brought to life on stage alongside a live 10-piece band inside a purpose-built venue in London. The response was extraordinary. From its opening in May 2022, the show attracted more than 1.3 million ticket holders representing over 140 nations. The digital performers did not merely replicate the originals. They surpassed expectation in ways that felt genuinely moving. Benny, characteristically, involved himself in every granular detail of the sound design, demanding that the experience be emotionally honest, technically impeccable, and true to everything ABBA had always represented. Perhaps the most telling decision of all was the group's quiet refusal of a $1 billion offer to tour conventionally. They had no interest in chasing something that belonged to the past. Instead, they defined the future on their own terms, exactly as Benny had always done. Now in his late 70s, Benny Andersson no longer retreats behind the shelter of a perfect chord or the controlled environment of a recording studio. In a series of recent interviews, he has been methodically dismantling the emotional walls he spent a lifetime constructing. He has acknowledged openly that music was the only language in which he ever truly knew how to express what he felt. Pain, love, longing, regret. All of it went into the songs because he never learned how to speak it directly to the people who needed to hear it from him. He once reflected that he gave his finest, most truthful lines to his compositions rather than to the human beings in his life. That admission reframes the entire ABBA story. Benny was not a cold or indifferent man. He was frightened. Frightened of the raw, ungovernable emotions that churned beneath every love song he composed, every ballad of heartbreak he sculpted, every glittering hit that concealed something much darker underneath. That fear, that inability to bridge the gap between the music and the man, was ultimately what hollowed out the band from within. Not scandal, not ego, not greed. Simply the very human fragility that fame had never prepared any of them to confront. And yet there is something quietly beautiful in the courage it takes to finally speak. In choosing honesty over mystique, Benny is offering something that ABBA as a functioning group never could: a genuine ending. He is telling anyone who will listen that perfection was never the point. Survival was. The music was not a shield that protected them from their pain. It was the vessel through which they endured it. And that, perhaps more than any chart position or award or record broken, is why the songs have never faded. They were not glossy fictions. They were fragments of four real people doing their best to hold themselves together under extraordinary pressure. And now, after decades of silence, the man who built it all from his seat at the piano has finally opened the door and let the rest of us inside.